Hey everybody, welcome back to City Skylines 2 and welcome back to St. Luke. In today's episode I'm doing something which is probably a little bit too ambitious, so spoilers already, I'm not going to be able to finish what I've started in this episode, but then again, it's a little much to be honest. For this episode we are allowed to go up to one of the later milestones in the game, and actually go for, I think it is a big city already. Whichever milestone it was, it's quite far, and we're also allowed to have videos of up to an hour long, which is alright, I think, if you're mostly playing the game live and trying to commentate along the way and see what kind of things you can build. But in my case, I'm still trying to time-lapse everything to just about the same speed as the last few episodes. So in the end, that means that I have somewhere between 7 and 8 hours of recording in this video already, and I was nowhere near finished to the level that I was hoping to be, which I guess is kind of like Hofstadter's Law. I don't know if any of you guys have ever heard of Hofstadter's Law, but it basically means that anything you want to do is going to end up taking longer than you think it's going to take, even taking into account Hofstadter's Law. So it's just kind of a fun self-referential thing there, but that's totally what ended up happening here. Even taking this into account, I figured I could at least kind of finish what I started out doing here, but no way. Basically, I'm trying to build a, well, small to medium-sized city, including an old city center, some 19th century neighborhoods around it, and all kinds of suburbs, and I'm not sure what it's going to be called yet, so if you guys want to give name suggestions, you're very welcome. I know I liked using the generator on the last episode, but also in the comments you guys came up with really great name ideas, so I'm still open for suggestions as well. But basically, I'm trying to build a big city here, the city on the mainland across the water from St. Luke. And the idea is that it's a kind of port city, and for my inspiration here I went to a different region, whereas most of St. Luke itself is inspired by Plymouth and that area in the south of England. I went in a whole nother direction for inspiration for this city and kind of looked at the area of Newcastle. Just kind of happened because, well, this is a port city and I was looking for medium-sized port cities in the UK and how they tend to develop. So it was just a fun way to reference something for this build. Now, in terms of the order in which I'm doing things, I'm not completely doing things in a chronological sort of sense. Like I said with St. Luke, I think it's usually the best idea to kind of chronologically work your way from older ages to newer ages, and you sort of organically get a city that looks like it's organically grown over time. You know, you want to start off with some rural fields, make a basic rural looking layout, and then you want to start filling in the old city center and growing neighborhoods around that in the same shape that your old rural fields were. And generally that way you end up getting a pretty organic city. And then once you start adding railroads and highways and stuff like that, you really have to move your way around some of the older neighborhoods and parks and stuff like that. And that's typically how you get a city that looks realistic. I think something that ends up happening a lot when you build cities just kind of from a flat, empty space of land is that everything just looks a bit too planned. You know, the railroad is very conveniently placed near the middle of the city, and the rail lines are all very convenient. You've got a highway that doesn't seem to, you know, have to move around anything and has perfectly fine exits and entries and stuff like that. And it results in very nice, functional cities that are kind of satisfying to look at in that way, I guess. But something which makes cities kind of real is that they are very messy, and sometimes you have to shoehorn some things in, because that's just how they develop. So as much as I would have liked to take that approach for this build, I think it would have taken even longer, and it would have also resulted in this episode being very much like the past two episodes, and then only from that point onward we could actually start building on it. Plus, I wouldn't get anywhere near the milestone that I'm trying to reach for this video, so even though I might not actually reach it in this video either, at least I'm getting close, and at least by the end of this video we'll have a large extent of the city already done, to the extent that I'm planning to finish it in the next video. So this is something that I still want to continue until we have a realistic region that kind of blends the urban and rural together and really make it feel like, you know, this city at some point in the future really has a context, with St. Luke on the other side of the water, and on this side of the water having all kinds of villages and stuff around it. But yeah, in this episode, I'm just starting off with the city center and trying to figure out how this city could have grown over time, while I come up with road networks and stuff like that, which is also very fun. I find in a way that it's very similar to doodling. You just put your pen to paper and start working on stuff and think of things that you want to do along the way, and that's just really fun. So for the start of this build, I decided to reroute the railroad a little bit, because we want the railroad to kind of curve around some neighborhoods and come a bit closer to the city center. I think realistically, you have like a few blocks between the train station and the old historic city center, so that's kind of what we have here. We have a curvy road, the one you can see in the middle of the screen here, and alongside that you see the little path in a sort of triangle shape. My headcanon for this is that this is one of the old, you know, star-shaped city walls that would have been alongside the edges of the historic city center. And most of it is gone at this point. We don't really have any city walls anymore. But most really old cities still have a layout around the city center where you can tell that there used to be a city wall, and maybe some of the areas have been turned into parks and others have become residential, but you can still kind of see the shape a little bit. And that's also what I tried doing here. You know, on two sides, this city center is of course flanked by the water, so we don't really need to think about defenses too much there. But on the other side, this round road over here is basically where the old city wall would have been, and we still have some parks alongside the edges left in there. But toward the train station, we just have one straight road, which is something that you'll very typically find in the 19th century for all European countries, is that you get these large city blocks built in the 19th century to go straight from the station to the old historic center, and they're usually also kind of a little bit of a show-off area. You have this kind of fancy architecture to welcome people into the city. At some point in time, when railroads were still the major way to get into cities. Nowadays, of course, it's usually highways, and speaking of which, here's my attempt to try and make some junctions. Please excuse my ineptitude at some points. This is literally my first time making highway junctions in City Skylines 2. And one thing I have to say, which I don't think I've said enough in the video so far, the road system has to be one of the biggest improvements in this game compared to the first one. It's just so satisfying to blend different roads together, make sure you have some realistic looking junctions, and most of all, the fact that you can have actual exit and entrance ramps and actually have some slip lanes on the highways, and very easily as well, especially because when you upgrade a road, you can kind of differentiate where you want the upgrade to be. Some wider, you of course have some roads that are a little bit wider than some other roads, and when you replace an older, smaller road by a wider road, you can freely choose where exactly you start to replace that. So you can also move the road a little bit to a side. And when you make these slip lanes, you can very easily blend them into your junctions. So honestly, the highway system is really amazing, really fun to work with, and it's really easy to make junctions that look realistic. And yeah, just make really nice interchanges overall. Something to note about that as well, while we go to some other part of the city, is that looking at the highway system in the UK, I found that a lot of intersections are, or interchanges rather, are, well, roundabout based. Either they're a very large roundabout with the entrance and exit ramps, or they're a dog bone interchange where you kind of have two roundabouts. It's not literally a dog bone, which is what I was trying to build right there for a second until I realized that it wasn't quite as easy as doing separate roundabouts, which is something that I see much more in the UK than actual dog bone interchanges, where it's typically one roundabout kind of shaped like a dog bone, hence the name of the junction, intersection, interchange. Speaking of which, little vocabulary thing. I guess an intersection and a junction are the same thing, and just a a place where roads come together at the same level, and you have a roundabout or traffic lights or stuff like that, and an interchange is where, of course, you have highways coming together and flyovers and stuff like that. I don't know, I guess I was talking without thinking about it too much. But anyway, you typically find these interchanges with intersections with roundabouts a lot in the UK. So that's what I ended up going for with, well, actually I think all of the interchanges on the highways that I'm going to build in this video. It's just an easy way to instantly make it look very UK. And speaking of roundabouts, having roundabouts absolutely everywhere is also a very UK thing. Of course, they're very popular in other European countries as well. But I've really noticed that especially around highways and newer developments, you just find these arterial roads with roundabout after roundabout, and it just looks pretty UK to copy that whole feeling. Anyway, this is where the highway connects to the city center, so that's a pretty important road. And then between the highway and the railroad here, we have some commercial development and a little bit of residential as well. Looking at the general layout of UK cities, I find that there are many patches of commercial development around residential development. It's a little bit more random than, say, the Netherlands, for instance, where you find these very large commercial areas, especially around highways, and they're very well separated from residential area. It's a little bit more mixed in the UK, I found. So that's something that you'll also find. You'll find me at some small commercial sections with very light industry here and there, scattered between the residential areas. And speaking of which, there are a bunch of different urban fabrics that inspired me for different parts of this build. So first of all, of course, we have the city center here on the right here, which is very messy, lots of random roads everywhere. Has a bit of a circular layout because of course it would have had a circular-ish wall around it in medieval times. And beside from that, just lots of little bendy roads. Something that's also relevant about this location is that I built this extra little canal here, which wasn't there in the map originally, but originally I felt that there wasn't really a good place to start a city. Most cities start around some kind of river or the sea, a body of water in any case, and the river here is very much on the edge of the map, so you can't really build the city all around it. So I decided to add this extra branch of the river where, you know, realistically this is some kind of delta area, so I think it's realistic to have this river branch off into two parts around here. So we have a bit of a nicer historical center for the city to grow out of. So yeah, that's the first kind of neighborhood. Then we also get these 19th century expansions, which I already built a few of just now, which have much more straight roads and lots of row houses, or as somebody in the comments of the first or the second video said correctly, they're called terraced houses in the UK. Something I always have to get used to. It's like the kind of thing that I do know somewhere, but I'm just much more used to saying row houses, and I guess that's because it's also the literal translation of the word in Dutch. But yeah, it's very fair. They're terraced houses. And originally, the fact that we have row houses in the game at this point is what kind of inspired me to do this English build in the first place, because I figured we could finally do some Victorian-esque 19th century British neighborhoods. Unfortunately, the row houses don't quite look like that, but it's close, and I think you can sort of imitate the look as well. But the other thing about it is that the demand for them is just not there, and this is something that I actually had a discussion about with some friends recently. Personally, I feel like row houses or terraced houses, for the record, I'm just gonna stick to row houses from this point onward because it feels more natural to me, but do know what I'm talking about. I just feel like, in general, that type of housing is low density, and maybe it's because I'm from the Netherlands and it's just, we view any kind of house where you own the land that your house is built on and you have a little bit of land around it as low density. And personally, I would see it this way. I think all kinds of row houses, semi-detached and detached especially, of course, too, are low-density residential, and then medium-density residential would be apartment buildings without elevators, you know, a max of 4 floors, maybe 5, not super big, but not super small either, or some streets where you have a couple of apartments per building, stuff like this. I think Amsterdam, for instance, is medium density. It doesn't have skyscrapers, it doesn't have big apartment blocks, but it does have buildings of 4 to 5 floors where each floor has a separate apartment. So personally, I would think that's kind of medium density, and then high density, of course, is larger apartment blocks and stuff like that. So, I don't know, I'm kind of in a little bit of a disagreement with the game. I think it's understandable that the row houses in the game are medium density, especially if I think about Finland, where the creators are from. I don't think row houses are very common in Finland, and if they do exist, they're more around city centers and older parts of cities. Generally, looking at Finnish cities, you can find some dense-ish city centers, but around that, lots of detached and semi-detached neighborhoods. So I think that's fair, and especially if you're looking at it from an American perspective, then row houses are very rare to see, and you mostly see them in maybe the brownstone buildings of New York and places like that. Boston, I know, has them. But then it also definitely feels like medium density for the US, and the US lacks in medium density in general, which is a big issue. But yeah, overall, all things considered, I personally feel like row houses are low density, but unfortunately the game doesn't agree with me. And this means that I wanted to zone all of these, well, these are the Victorian neighborhoods with their long straight roads, and they're very close together, so you get some small gardens in between, but not that much space. And ideally these would have all been row houses, but unfortunately, because the row houses count to medium density demand, and there's not that much of it, I'm gonna have to zone a lot of this as low density. So I don't know if this is a huge complaint at the game, because personally I kinda trust that once the game is released and we get mods, we're gonna get some kind of ploppable Rico or demand master or whatever it is. It's gonna get modded, and we're gonna plop buildings, and cities are gonna look very different from the way they're looking right now in this vanilla unreleased build. But still, it's something that I have to keep in mind right now. Anyway, moving on to a different area, and to actually talk about what I'm doing again. I always kept this area reserved for industrial stuff, and mainly the harbor, because this would be a port city, so that's what we're shaping out here. And the natural landscape already kind of had this sort of shape, so I figured it was the right fit to do this with. And yeah, it's just gonna be one big industrial area. Something I noticed is that cargo trains have become more relevant in this game compared to the first game, but honestly I didn't even think of that personally, the importance of using cargo trains to move your stuff around in this game. I just think any realistic industrial area, especially if you've got a larger one, it just needs a cargo train station, because for heavy industry, rail is really important to move your goods around. Trucks are fine for retail and stuff like that, but heavy industry just needs rail. So realistically, you want to have some kind of connection anyway. And in this case, my connection is actually pretty professional, I think. If you look at most industrial areas, the rail isn't quite as, you know, fancy as passenger rail is. It'll typically have lots of level crossings and just look a bit wonky. But yeah, this was a pretty clean connection to make to the rail lines. And then on the other side, where this rail is eventually going to continue, we have one of the first things I built in this episode, which is the big rail yard over there, which I also think is a realistic area for a rail yard. Usually a rail yard is pretty close to the central station, somewhere around the outskirts of the town though, and in this case it's right between the outskirts of the town, the city center, and the harbor here. So I think it's the right location, and then all of the trains can go from the harbor to the rail yard, get sorted, and move on. And aside from that, I also figured the harbor was a good place to put lots of big industrial buildings that I still want to have anyway. So there's the garbage burner building, which is huge, absolutely massive, which I'm very happy with. One of the things which always kind of irked me about City Skylines 1 is that service buildings were just so small, and for a building like this, it just needs to be big to be realistic. So it just makes it look more realistic, but it also means it's a little bit more of a challenge to fit these services in, and you can't just plop them down anywhere you want, whenever you want them. You really have to think about the sort of spatial planning aspect of putting a building like this in your city, which I think is very nice. The one thing I do kind of miss about this, though, is we have to think about how to connect this building to the grid, because as you can see, it is going to power the city, because we're gonna burn our waste and then generate some electricity. So we do need a high voltage connection. But those power lines are still pretty flexible. You can infinitely connect a number of power lines and stuff like that, and that's just not quite realistic. I do really appreciate what they did with the game, with having these transformer stations be necessary to connect high to low voltage, which is very realistic, but also a fun gameplay element. So really good combination of both of these aspects of making a city building game. But at the same time, connecting power lines the way that you can in this game is just a little bit too flexible and a little bit too easy. I get why they went with it, because you don't want to be building substations everywhere. But in real life, it's very common to find them along the routes of high voltage lines. And at some point near the end of this episode, I'm still going to build an extra substation somewhere to really make it look like these different high voltage lines are connecting through a little hub. Which is realistically what you want when you're making this kind of infrastructure. It's something to also think about a lot in real life. At least personally, I don't talk about this that much, but I work as a policy advisor for sustainability in a small town in the Netherlands in the urban planning department. And one of the biggest challenges that the country, but also the region, and well, basically every level of government is going through, not just in the Netherlands, but I imagine everywhere in the Western world right now, is the huge challenge of making the grid adapt to our new energy situation. Traditionally, the grid more or less works in a way that you have a generator somewhere, be it nuclear or fossil fuel powered, and that's just where all of the electricity comes from, and then you just have to transport it to the people who want it. It's a very one-way system. But now that we're making the energy transition from fossil fuels to renewables, very slowly but surely, we start to move toward a very different grid, where there's power generation and demand happening everywhere and at different times depending on the weather and whatever activities people are up to. And you need a system that's much more robust, but also has this kind of option for two-way traffic everywhere. So lots of national grids have to be expanded, and the same goes for the Netherlands. I know a bunch of lines across the country are already almost at their max, but even locally, lots of neighborhoods, once enough people start putting solar panels on their houses, at some points on sunny days, they're just gonna have to actually cut down the power on the solar panels and stop them from producing, because there's just no grid space to transport it on anymore. So huge challenges to face in real life, something we don't have to worry about too much in City Skylines, I think, but I'm not sure. And that's something I'm actually curious about when we get to much bigger cities, whether those power lines will be enough, or whether you need to double up on your power lines and cut through neighborhoods to create a new power line, which is realistically what's going to have to happen in the real world at some point. But not just that, we need lots of extra small low voltage transformer stations in many neighborhoods. But yeah, I'm getting a bit sidetracked by this topic. I just think it's one of the most interesting topics in terms of urban planning that you don't find that much in city builder games like this, but I'm already hugely impressed that we have transformers to begin with, and we have to think about how we transport the electricity a little bit better than in the first game. But on the other hand, we can import electricity as well, so I'm not too concerned about my power generation. I think that's probably fine. Anyway, moving into this area of the city, I wanted to add an extra small highway around here. It's not as big as the other highway, it's just a highway without a median in the middle. And something I really like is that with the new slip lanes we can actually create interchanges with these highways as well, which is something that I kind of missed in City Skylines 1, and it's very easy to do this in this game. So you can really make some local highways as well, which you don't need to move too much traffic on, but you still don't want level crossings on, which I think is quite nice. These kinds of highways could do very well in rural areas where you still want one high traffic road. So really cool to see, really fun to work with as well. Anyway, moving into this part of the town, we start to leave some of the older 19th century expansions of the city behind and start to move into some more 20th century style expansions, which, at least from my bit of Google Maps research and just looking around, are a little bit more planned, more curvy neighborhoods, but they still really follow the previous rural landscape. So for a lot of these areas, I'm trying to build some roads first that look like they could have been, you know, connecting roads between the farm fields back in the day, and then try to fill the gaps in between with lots of bendy roads and, well, a generally planned looking structure. And then once it's all in place, start building the houses. There are also lots of parks in between. Something I noticed about UK cities is that from above they tend to look very clustered. You really have some clusters of residential areas with in between still some green areas, and really it looks like partly still the rural landscape is intact in some places, with some of the parks looking more like grassy fields with rows of trees around it, and really still following the shape of the old farm fields that used to be in place back in the day. And sometimes parks, but this is typical for English gardens in general, really just kind of mimic the natural landscape. If you consider, for instance, French gardening, French parks are very symmetrical. They're all about shapes and geometry, so you have all of these hedges in straight patterns and stuff like that. Looks very fancy, but English parks and gardens are very much about trying to recreate the traditional English landscape with lots of grass and some tree lines and stuff like that, which I think, you know, they both have their merits, but I really like the English approach. It looks a little bit more natural, and this even goes for, I think, some parks inside the cities and suburbs, which is quite nice. So even though they're suburbs, some of them still have a kind of rural or urban, some people would say, look to them, which I quite like. But yeah, that's about that. Then there's the fact that all of these bendy roads don't really result in the best the functioning residential areas, in the sense that there will be all kinds of gaps between the houses, but I think that's also fine. I recently had a friend ask me if the curvy roads are a bit more doable in this game compared to the first one, and I think because the zoning system works exactly the same, it's not really gotten any better. It also hasn't gotten any worse. I think to make a realistic city center, we're just gonna need some kind of plopping mod, because it's just not gonna happen with a game like this. You know, you can't have your buildings connect if they're on a curve. You get all of these gaps in between, which is, it makes sense. I think it would be very difficult to figure out another way to do it. But yeah, I think it works fine for suburbs like this. In fact, I might actually prefer it, because you get some gaps in between where you can plant trees and just make the neighborhood more green. So I think it works here. I think that just in city centers, it's a little bit more annoying. One thing I did notice about the zoning next to curvy roads is that it does spawn into reasonable shapes, I think. For some of these curves you can tell that some weird shapes ended up happening, but for most of them, I think whatever algorithm is behind this comes up with reasonable shapes where you don't get very small plots of land, but you still have some good, decent sized zonable areas, so you can actually get some nice buildings alongside curvy roads. And if you make your road just a little bit curvy, you don't actually get too many issues with all kinds of different clustered grids. You can actually have one whole section of zonable land in a single grid next to a very slightly curvy road. So Making your roads very slightly curvy, as you'll often see in the UK, is more or less fine. You won't run into too many issues there. Something to also note is that these 19th and 20th century neighborhoods kind of follow the railroad instead of the other way around, but you might still have some older roads going through these areas that continue on both sides of the railroad, because they would have already been there before rail was there. So this is really an area where you kind of have to think a little bit of like what kind of roads are already centuries old and going through farm fields. These need to kind of be cut through by rail, and then between that the newer developments are kind of filled in within that, and you don't really have a real line cutting straight through a 19th century expansion, for instance. It'll usually actually be built alongside the rail. So, you can try to build in one go as if the city has grown organically if you keep things like this in mind, but still, I do find it's a little bit easier and maybe even a little bit more fun, perhaps to watch as well, to do it the realistic way. But it's just going to take so much more time, especially because you're doing a lot of work that you're undoing at some later stage and really trying to visualize the growth of a city over time. And ain't nobody got time for that, at least not right now. Also, I decided to make the rail line a little bit weirdly shaped like that over there, just because we're out of space on the map, but I didn't want to weirdly cut the rail over the interchange over there, so it is what it is. And then over here I decided I also wanted an exit, an entry ramp for this little local highway as well, which also works. Better than I expected. I guess this would be a half a clover leaf, kind of, with two roundabouts on the side, but it's still a nice kind of intersection. I'm not sure if I've seen too many of these in the UK. It feels a little bit more Dutch. It's something you very typically find in the Netherlands, but it doesn't matter too much, and I think it's the only thing that fits here, because otherwise it would be too close to the big roundabout interchange over there. So yeah, we just have to do it. Also, I decided to add some tree lines alongside all of the highways and the exits, and also some of the rail lines. It's just something that you find in a lot of English cities. Not just the rural landscape is filled with tree lines, but also the cities, alongside all kind of infrastructure, and I guess it's an easy decision to make whenever you're building some kind of large infrastructure to just plant trees alongside the whole thing. Plus it serves a function as well, of course. It's a sound barrier, a very natural sound barrier, so we like to have these things. Also, another thing that's worth noting is that I switched to a new version of the game at some point in the middle of this video. I did only start working on this video when we got the newest build of the game at the time when we could start working on the third video, but somewhere through the middle of that process, a few days ago, a new update was released with seasons, which is super exciting. So you suddenly see it becoming autumn in this video here, and the next we'll move into winter and everything's gonna look dark for a little bit, but once spring and summer comes around you can really see the lighting change as well. And I think autumn looks amazing. I'm really happy with this change, actually. Really positively surprised by how the trees look, and just in general how much the overall vibe and lighting of the maps change depending on the season. Really cool to see. So overall, I don't think I have too much to add about that. Just the fact that it's unfortunately a little hard to see exactly how these changes affect the city. Because all the trees that I'm planting right now and, making all these tree lines and filling in some of the gaps between different parts of the city with some forest, all of those saplings still need to grow. Something else I noticed actually, and that you don't get to see too much in this video, but you've probably seen it in the cinematic in the beginning. Trees die in this game as well, and once they die they leave a sapling behind that starts growing in their place again. And I'm not entirely sure how much I like this. I think it's cool that they have this realistic dynamic going on. And it's also nice because the age that trees get is kind of random. There's probably some kind of normal deviation to it. But in any case, I noticed that all of my tree lines on the main island have already died a few times and started growing again. And it makes it so that different trees are in different phases of their growth. And it just makes the whole thing look a lot more natural. So that's nice. But it does happen very often, so almost half of my tree lines are either dead or tiny saplings at any point in time. And I don't know, I kind of wish we could extend the life of a tree a little bit, because it does feel, to me, a little bit unrealistic, in a sense that they die very quickly and then a new one starts growing already. But it does result in some pretty nice forests and tree lines. I think it's a realistic touch that they added this. So overall, I'm pretty happy with it. But it's definitely something I started noticing in my older areas. Can sometimes make things look a little bit funky. Also, I just realized that the interchange that I've been talking about the whole time isn't a dog bone, but a dumbbell interchange, which I guess is fair. It kind of does look like a dumbbell, but a little bit different as well. So something along those lines. Also, at this point, I started thinking about my electricity network and my power lines and how I was going to move power around the city. Eventually, I decided that I did want some areas to look like a power line is really cutting through an area, and we have these, these kind of park-like landscapes underneath the power lines, and they just cut through neighborhoods and stuff like that, which realistically, you do want this to happen. There's something about really high voltage power lines that they're much more expensive and difficult to put underground than lower voltage power lines. So even in the Netherlands, where most power lines are underground at this point, this is only up to a certain voltage. I think something like 150 to 220 kilovolts is still doable to put underground, but the main network of 380 kilovolts is just completely undoable, or at least not practical. I know in the Netherlands there's one section where they put this very high voltage power line underground, but it's tremendously expensive and also quite difficult in terms of maintenance. It's just the higher up you go in voltage, the more insulation you need and everything, and it just becomes harder progressively, depending on the voltage, to put these lines underground. So to summarize, it's generally a reason why I still wanted above ground power lines to actually go through the city and come up with a way to make them realistically, go through it. Another thing to keep in mind is that you can very easily make very curvy power lines in the game, but in real life it's much more typical to see power lines with very large straight sections, because curves are not very easy to do on power lines, and you don't want to add too many of them in any given line, because you need special pylons for it, and they're a little bit more labor and resource intensive, and it just looks a bit more realistic if your power lines are very straight for large sections and then curve in certain parts. And I've also built this kind of super station here in the bottom left, where a bunch of power lines come together, split off. One goes to St. Luke, one goes to the garbage incinerator, and then one goes to the outside connection. So I think that's a decent electricity network. I really couldn't think of a way to connect the power line on the other side of the city, so I think I'm just gonna have a power station on the other side of the city and then just connect to the low voltage network inside the city, and I think that's fine. I don't think you need 2 outside connections per se, at least with this one outside connection, I do have 2 outside connections, but they don't need to be connected basically to each other. If they both feed the city, and if we have our main electricity producer hooked up to the city itself, I think we'll be fine in terms of our power network. It just means that I don't have to have a weird power line cut through the city's center, and at some point in the future I think it would make sense to have the power line kind of cut around the city. If you look at maps of power lines, you'll typically find that just like highways, they'll often have some rings around big cities, because they do need to feed the big cities, but you don't want the power lines to go straight through them, and putting them underground is, for the aforementioned reasons, not very doable all the time either. So yeah, that's always a realistic option for later as well. Anyway, at this point of the video, I was realizing that I was already recording for a very long time and didn't really have a completely realistic and finished section of the map done. So that's a little bit of an oof, but at the same time, I think I just wanted to finish as much as I could, and especially around this area, fill in some of the gaps that were still left. Unfortunately, some fields are still going to be empty because, as you can see, I keep building low residential, but I also keep having low residential demand. And every time I add extra low residential, it fills up, and it fills in some of the older high density residential and commercial zones and industrial zones that I already built. But then we just have to keep on going. And still the city center wasn't, you know, filled in to the extent which I would like it to be. And you still have all of these areas which are zoned as row houses, which is still not getting built because the demand for it is just not there. So it is what it is. I'm gonna have to keep building for much longer than I could fit into this one video to actually have enough low density residential to make the high density residential and commercial city center. So there's just no other way to do that. So, you know, even if I don't like it that much, there was no way that I was going to finish this city to the extent that I wanted to in this video, because it's just going to take way too much low density residential to make as large and dense of a city center that I'm planning right here. Also, at this point, I figured it was time to add the university, which I think it looks a little bit more like an American university because it's got all of these large gardens around it and it's a big fancy building like this. I think UK universities tend to be a little bit more in the city center and a little bit more connected to different buildings around them, which makes sense. But yeah, it is what it is. I think I just wanted to have a university somewhere, so I just ended up using the American kind of layout in the end, with a big main university building and then some other faculty buildings around it kind of look. But yeah, it definitely does look a bit American, I think. Also, I decided to put it on the hill here, so at least we have some nice buildings to see in the distance when we look at the city from the ground. So that's pretty cool. And around it we have some of the most expensive and chic neighborhoods of the city, so very loose urban fabric, lots of squiggly roads, lots of large houses, and a separate train station as well. And that's the last neighborhood that I decided to work on for this video, so I'd like to thank you guys for watching, and I'll leave you with some cinematic shots, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one where we are going to finish this city. See ya!